Hi everyone, welcome to another video on Jujutsu Kaisen Phantom Prey. And in today's video, I am going to do a guide on how to team build. Now, team building in this game is actually extremely easy because there are, to be honest, only two types of strategy. One is the burst team, which you can either burst with a single DPS or you can burst with two DPS in the same team. Or if you cannot use this strategy, then the second strategy you want to try is going to be a stall team, and that can be done either with Mahito or it can be done with an actual DPS of the right color. And those four teams, to be honest, is going to cover 99% of the content in this game. Now, I will mention another honorable mention, which is this counter team that may be fun to play, but a lot of time it's just being completely outclassed by the stall team, and I will talk about this at the end of the video. But yeah, honestly speaking, once you learn how to play the first four team I'm going to talk about, you have no problem with 99% of the content in this game. Let's start off with the burst team. So burst team, as the name suggests, you have one DPS mainly, and you want to just kill off the enemy as quickly as possible. And to do that, you're going to have one damage dealer, normally the one which is your strongest of that color, and then follow up with three supporters. Now for the three supporters, you want to maximize the damage output, and have a guide on this previously. If you haven't seen that already, I'll link that in the video description. But basically the idea is that you want to choose different type of buffing or debuff skill, and the three different types is going to be curse technique or physical technique increase, which is what Yaga's have. You then have another one which is curse technique or physical technique decrease, and that's normally going to be Gakuganji or Geto. And then the third one, which is the broadest category, is damage dealt buff or debuff. And the most notable ones here will be Nanami, Momo, or Incomplete Domain Megumi as well, if you have it. So those all fall into the same category. And the idea is that if you have a combination of three of them, that's how you maximize your damage, because you will be multiplying all of those buffs together. For more details, like I said, watch the video I created previously in the description below. Now, when you have those three different type of supporters, you are able to maximize your damage output. However, every now and then you may also need to adjust this in order to have some kind of utility in your team. For example, if you actually want to nuke very early because the enemy may have a very strong special attack, and therefore you need to nuke before the enemy special attack is there. In those cases, then you play a utility character such as Toge. And the thing is, Toge, you would want to use this because his skill 2 is able to increase ultimate gauge and therefore allowing your DPS to nuke earlier. However, outside of that, Toga have no use, and normally if that's the case, you then want to place a taunt regression on your Toga, so that your Toga dies very quickly, and then you can sub in a third supporter from the back. And normally your supporter from the back is going to be Momo, because Momo can stack up the maximum amount of buff in just 2 turns, and therefore she is one of the best short term buffer in the game. So that's kind of why you almost always want to play Momo at the back when you have a utility character in your main team. Now Toge is one good example of utility character, and like I said, depending on how early you want to nuke, you always want to play a taunt regression on Toge. However, depending on how early you want to nuke, i.e. how many skill 2 Toge need to use, you may also want to play mutual trust, for example, in your team, so your Toge can actually use his skill 2 back to back, and that will increase your which turn you nuke even quicker. The other alternative option for utility character might be Kaito. And normally Kaito is there for two purposes. For example, if the enemy have a way of reducing your curse energy, then Kaito is going to be very good, because Kaito has the ability to actually, his skill 3 to actually increase curse energy for your whole team. So that makes Kaito very good for those kind of scenario. The other reason why Kaito is also very good as a utility character is because his ultimate attack is also a buff itself. And this actually lasts for 3 turns, which basically means that Kaito can actually die after he releases, and the buff will still be there available for your DPS character, provided he didn't actually use any other attack which would eat up that buff. And this is actually one of the best way of you can maximize the amount of damage, because this actually allows you to get essentially 4 character worth of buff all in your team. Because Kaito, once he releases his ultimate attack, he can then die, allowing your force supporter to actually come in, and therefore your DPS is actually going to benefit from 4 supporting skills rather than just 3. So that would be another reason why you may want to use Kaito rather than, let's say, a traditional buffer such as Nanami on your team. So those are the different variation of the burst team you can do. Once you have figured out what team you are going to play, i.e. whether you need any utility character, which turn you need to nuke, etc., then you can decide the reflections accordingly. For example, if you will be able to kill off the enemy before he is doing too much damage to you, then you can go all damage buff increasing, etc. However, or maybe the enemy may be able to actually get off one attack on you, which is very strong, in which case you might want to play mutual trust for AoE damage reduction, or you may want to play this R reflection, which allow you to dodge twice for 2 single target attacks. So depending on exactly who the enemy is and which turn you want to nuke, you can then decide whether you want to bring some more defensive reflections or you are going to bring some more offensive damage buffing reflection. But that's basically the main crux of how to do a burst. Now let's talk about the next variation of a burst team, which is basically when you have 2 DPS. Now from damage point of view, I can tell you this is always going to do less damage than 3 supporter plus 1 DPS. And the reason is quite simple, because for example, if I just compare those two teams, I am basically swapping out, for example, my Nanami, who's my buffer, with another DPS character. If you just take a look at how much damage increase Nanami is able to give, provided you can stack this for 4 turns, what this is able to do is 4 times 34, which is about 140% increase. So that basically means by playing Nanami, by default, you are going to allow your DPS to do more than double of what he can normally does, because his buff is more than 100%, right? However, if you actually change that to a second DPS, by definition, your second DPS does less damage than your main DPS. So by default, when you play 2 DPS, the total damage output is less than twice of what your single strongest DPS is able to do. In comparison, when you play with 3 supporters, you're able to do more than double of what your single strongest DPS is able to do. So purely from damage point of view, 3 supporter plus 1 DPS is always going to be better than 2 DPS plus 2 supporter. So if that's the case, what scenario would you actually use this 2 DPS situation? This is mainly going to be used when you face stages which have multiple waves, and therefore you need to nuke twice. And the reason is, for example, let's take imagine round battles. They are normally the best example. The enemy have 2 waves. If you are actually going to have one single nuke for each wave, it's going to take you a lot longer for you to nuke. Not to mention the enemy may actually be able to kill you before you get to your second nuke, or maybe decrease your ultimate energy gauge, etc. So therefore, it's not going to be effective for you to actually have one single DPS and try to do 2 rotation of attacks. And that's kind of basically the situation where when there are actually multiple phases or multiple waves in a battle, 2 DPS could actually be suitable, because you can basically set yourself up so that you have 1 DPS for one the first phase, and then you have the second DPS for the second phase, etc., and therefore rotate your attacks accordingly. So those are pretty much the only situation I would play like a 2 DPS plus 2 supporter. Otherwise, vast majority of the time, you'll be much better off just going with 3 supporter plus 1 DPS. Okay, so those are going to be the 2 main damage dealing strategies. If your damage is, those are normally, first of all, the first strategy you want to try, because they're very short and very easy to pull off. However, if your damage is just still not enough after those, then you have to go into a stall strategy. And the stall strategy, as the name suggests, it's going to be a long battle. It's normally going to take 30, 40 turns. And the idea is that you slowly wear down the enemy. And once again, there's going to be 2 variations with the stall team. You can either do it with Mahito, or you can do it with an actual DPS of the right color. Now, Mahito one is probably the most common one and the most universal one, so I'm going to start off with that first. And the idea is that Mahito have his ultimate attack, which is always able to do 15% damage, scaling based on 15% HP damage, scaling based on enemy's own HP. And that basically means no matter what color the enemy is, Mahito is always going to have that consistent damage output. However, when you are doing all of this, basically you have to make sure you are able to do this quick enough, and also you're able to survive at the same time. And this is where then the rest of the team is going to come in. You basically have normally at least one form, or sorry, you would need two types of damage reduction on your team, and then also one battery to help your team always have the ability to do whatever they want. The battery is going to be Kaito, so Kaito and Hanami, Kaito and Mahito, they're kind of always compulsory for Mahito Stall strategy, because basically Kaito's needed in order to power the rest of the team, and Mahito's job is there for your damage dealing. And then for the other two slots, you then have basically a combination between Toge, Hanami, and Shoko, and depending on different situation, you would then choose which two characters you want to bring onto your team. Now, by default, if there's no difference, if the stage doesn't require certain type of characters, normally the best choice is going to be Toge and Hanami, because Toge and Hanami not only are able to provide that damage mitigation through their damage reduction, they're also able to Toge increase ultimate energy, and therefore Mahito is able to go through his ultimate domain expansion quicker, and also Hanami have his own domain expansion, which once you actually release it after Mahito's one, you're actually able to override it and therefore allow Mahito to quickly start charging up for his next domain expansion. So that's kind of why those two are the best choices. Shoko, whilst she's good, she can only be there for defensive capability. She's not actually able to increase how fast your Mahito is able to use his domain expansion. So that's kind of what normally you want to go with Toga and Hanami. However, every now and then you're going to get very annoying stages. For example, floor 45 in tower mode, when the enemy is actually immune to debuff, in which case Hanami is useless, and therefore you place Shoko instead of Hanami. Or for example, floor 46 in tower mode, when enemy use damage over time actually bypass any damage reduction buff, which makes Toge almost useless other than his ultimate gauge increase, and therefore you will replace Toge with Shoko. So yeah, basically depending on the situation, you just pick two characters out of those three. Now, once you have done that, then it's time for you to pick your recollections, etc. Unity is almost always compulsory if you do have it, because Unity is able to allow you to at least ult one turn quicker every single time when you do domain expansion, which is very much needed when you actually store them out for that long, especially when there are stages which have a hard cutoff of 40 turns, because the enemy will get like an insane buff after the first 40 turns, etc. So Unity, if you have it, is almost always compulsory. And the other compulsory one is always going to be some form of AoE healing. Now, whether you have Shoko or not, you are always going to need this AoE healing, because your Mahito and Hanami, they're cursed spirits, so they won't be able to be healed by Shoko. So even though they both have built-in self-healing, a lot of time they are not going to be enough. And that's kind of why this AoE healing, such as a Wish from Past, is almost always going to be necessary. Now, in terms of the reflection on Toge, depending on whether you have Shoko or not, if you do not have Shoko, you almost always want to place a self-healing one. And the reason is Toge is able to actually sacrifice his own HP when he uses attacks, and therefore his HP is going to go down a lot quicker than everyone else, and one single AoE reflection is not going to cut it, and that's kind of why you will have to bring a self-healing one on Toge. Now, if you do actually have Shoko on the team, for example, you're playing Shoko instead of Hanami, then you can then potentially swap this out to a different reflection, but if you don't have Shoko, this have to be 100% the one you want to do. And then in terms of the one on Hanami, there are lots of different choices, but my best suggestion is going to be one which can increase its own ultimate energy. And the reason is, normally what you're going to see is that basically, no matter how fast Mahito can release his what goes through one rotation of domain expansion, you are always going to be fixed to how fast your Hanami is able to do as well, because Hanami actually needs to override Mahito's domain expansion. So let's say even if your Mahito can get to his ult in 5 turns, if your Hanami is not ready on the same turn afterwards, then you essentially have like a 1 turn lag, and that is always very annoying. However, if you actually have an ultimate increase in recollection Hanamis, which is either going to be this one, Rest for Adults, or this one in Excellent Shape, then what you can do is you can have a perfect sync between Hanami and Mahito every single time, so that you can always get through their domain expansion. I think in 6 turns, I want to say. So every 6 turns, you're always able to get both of them to combo attack their ultimate attack, and therefore override domain expansion straight away. And that is going to be perfect. And that's kind of why I always recommend this type of recollection, the one that you can increase ultimate energy on Hanami. Now, there's also going to be another variation of the Mahito Stall strategy, and that is going to be for stages when the enemy have side minions or mobs alongside with them. And the reason is, while Mahito's ultimate attack, this is able to do an AoE attack to everyone. It's going to take you like 40 turns to actually kill off the enemy. And let's say, for example, there are 3 or 4 enemy all at the same time. Just imagine how much damage you will be taking if you have to tank that for 40 turns. Normally, those are not ideal. If it's just one enemy boss and tanking it for 40 turns, that's a lot more feasible. And normally, if that's going to be the case, what you actually want to do is you probably want to swap your Hanami or whichever character that you have with an actual DPS who have an ultimate attack or just one way of doing an AoE nuke. And the idea is that you have that DPS character to actually kill off all of the side mobs so that there's only one main boss remaining. And then afterwards, your Gojo or whoever DPS will be leaving the field because either it's after 7 turns or they got killed off, etc. And then your actual member of the Mahito Stall team can then come in, and then you have like a stall team against just one single enemy boss, and that's basically how you can then sustain yourself for 40 turns and just slowly wear down the enemy. So that's basically going to be the other variation of Mahito Stall team when the enemy actually have like multiple mob enemy at the same time. And now let's talk about the second type of store team, which is this DPS store team. Now it's gonna be slightly different to the Mahito store team, where you basically have Mahito who can always do fixed damage, and then you kind of have 3 supporters trying to make him to survive for as long as possible, or to make sure that he can charge his ult as quickly as possible. In a DPS store team, what you're gonna have is you have the actual DPS of the right color instead of Mahito. However, you also are going to bring buffer, and the idea is that you want to actually kill off the enemy a lot quicker rather than going through the full Mahito Stall. In what situation would you want to do this DPS stall instead of Mahito stall? It's normally going to be when the stage require you to do a significant amount of damage so that you actually kill off the stage a lot quicker than 40 turns. And there are going to be some good examples. One is going to be, for example, if the enemy have a self-healing capability, right? If you are using Mahito Stall team, you are not only able to do 15% of enemy HP every 6 or 7 turns, and if the enemy is able to heal back, just half of that is going to make you run twice as long, and it's just not going to be very much feasible if the enemy also have a buff after 40 turns where they can then one-shot you, etc. So in those kind of scenarios, when the enemy is able to consistently heal back their own HP, your Mahito Stall team is just not going to cut it. And instead, you probably don't have to use like a DPS Stall team. And hopefully, you can do a lot more than 15% of damage every few turns. And therefore, you can always out sustain the enemy this way. The other scenario where you want to use a DPS Stall team is going to be Imagine Round battles. And that's because in Imagine Round battles, there's normally 2 phases, right? Well, after you kill off the enemy's first HP bar, they normally come back with their ultimates all charged up, etc. for the second phase. And when that happens, if you have a Mahito Stall team, which takes 30 or 40 turns for just one single phase, there's no way you can beat both phases in less than 40 turns before the enemy get that insane buff. So once again, in those kind of scenarios, you have to make sure you have an alternative way for your DPS to do actually enough damage at the same time also stall long enough for you to slowly wear down the enemy. And that's kind of why if you actually look at a setup for DPS Stall team, you're going to have both one damage buffing supporter, but also one damage reducing supporter, which is going to be, in this case, Hanami, but sometimes you can also play SR Kaito instead, depending on the situation. Now, in terms of the buffer, you almost always want to play Yaga, and also I forgot to mention about the DPS. Normally, it will be the DPS of the right color. However, if the color doesn't matter too much, Team Gojo is normally going to be the best choice, and there's a reason why Team Gojo and Yaga are the go-to choices, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. Now, let's start off with the damage reduction slot first. If you're going to play Hanami in terms of the damage reduction character, because Hanami does have this very strong skill 3, remember his skill 3 costs 35 curse energy. And in order to make sure you can actually stack that up efficiently, you have to have Kaito onto your team so that you can actually have enough curse energy for your Hanami to stack it up. So that's kind of why if you're playing Hanami, these 2 characters are kind of fixed. However, if you do not want to play Hanami, like I said, another very good alternative is gonna be SR Kaito. Now the problem with SR Kaito is that his skill 2, which is a lot more energy efficient, it's only 20 curse energy, so that's kind of why it's so good. However, this can only be work against curse technique attacks. So you kind of need to take a look at what type of attack the enemy does first before deciding on whether you want to play Kaito or whether you're going to play the Hanami. The other benefit of Kaito, which is a bit of a double-edged sword, is that if you're actually playing Kaito, you are then not able to play the R version of himself as well, because you can't have two characters of the same name on the same team, which is a bad thing. However, it does allow you to free up your slot then for another buffer onto your team. Well, maybe Shoka if you want more defensive capability. But basically, you can then bring a third supporter onto your team, and that can be either offensive or defensive depending on the stage. And that could be an advantage for SR Kaito. So kind of depending on the enemy stage, the first choice you have to make in a DPS Stall team is whether you want to play Hanami or whether you want to play SR Kaito instead. Now, I'm just going to use the Hanami one as an example purely because it's focus technique and also physical technique, so it's probably a bit easier and more universal. But basically, if you do have this, you then basically have all of your defensive capability ready. It may not quite be enough because remember, for Mahito Stall team, you have two forms of damage reduction. However, for this one, you only have one character who's able to do damage reduction, and therefore you don't have to use your other type of ways to help to mitigate damage. And that's why I say Yaga and Tingojo are going to be the best choices because they both actually also have a debuff ability, which is actually reducing how much damage you take. For Yaga, it's going to be his ultimate attack, which is basically decreasing how much damage the enemy is going to do to you or how much you're going to take. And for Gojo, it's going to be his skill 3. And the idea is that no matter what the type of stage, normally the enemy's special attack is going to be the hardest hitting move. And so the idea is that when the enemy is about to use his special attack, you are going to have Yaga use his debuff skill, and also you're going to have your Gojo also use his debuff skill, or maybe even use it twice because this can be stacked 2 times, and that in conjunction with maybe also mutual trust as well is going to make sure you have enough ways to mitigate the damage from the enemy's strongest attack. And once you're able to survive that, you don't have like a wish from past, you then heal yourself back up, and then you can rinse and repeat, etc. And sometimes if one of your characters is actually on really low HP, you can even use Kaito's skill 2 to give additional damage taken decrease as well. And basically, that's how you would be able to make up for the lack of a second damage reduction character. And once you are able to sort that out with the combination of your recollection and also debuff skill from your DPS and you also your offensive supporter, then it's just a matter of actually just killing off the enemy. And like I said, because you have to have the DPS of the right color and also a buffer being Yaga, who's one of the best buffer in the game, you definitely have more than enough damage output to slowly wear down the enemy or at least outdo whatever he's able to heal back, etc. And remember, Kaito also have an offensive buff as well. So Kaito is actually quite pivotal here as well because he can also be used either for defensive or for offensive and also for his own utility capability. So that's kind of why you would then have this version of the Stall team where you are able to survive long enough with a combination of the different skills from your characters, but also have that offensive edge as well to make sure your DPS can outdo the enemies and just basically out-sustain them that way. So that is basically going to be the last meta common team you're going to see. And like I mentioned, these 4 teams together, they will allow you to clear like 99%, if not 100% of all the content in the game. The last honorable mention, like I said, I will talk about is going to be this counter team. It's a good, to be honest, it's completely outclassed by the Stall team because it's going to take a very long time as well, and it's not actually as consistent. But basically, the main idea behind this counter team is that you have your total, use his skill 2. This is going to apply counter attack or best friend status to the enemy, to the ally behind you, so that whenever they take a single target attack, you are able to counter attack back and apply a disruption. And that could be very, very nice. However, it costs curse energy to do that, which is why it's almost essential that you also have Kaito on your team. And then in terms of the character that you want with the best friend status, normally you want someone who have the ability to taunt, and Miwa is the best choice because Miwa is the most efficient taunt one because she's able to actually self taunt with just 30 curse energy every 2 turns. So that's basically the most efficient way of how you can taunt. But if you don't actually care much about efficiency, because for example your Kaito is also able to increase curse energy, etc., then you can also swap your Miwa to pretty much any character with like a taunt regression, but it just won't be as efficient, so you won't be countering an attack as much as you would like, etc. Now, in terms of the fourth member of the slot, normally counter attack is like very small chip damage, so you kind of want like a consistent damage buff throughout, and that's kind of what once again I'm going to say Yaga is going to be a good choice to provide the most amount of extra damage from every single chip damage you're going to do. Now, this because you'll just be slowly weighing down the enemy with your counterattack, and when you do your counterattack, you won't actually be taking damage yourself. By the way, you'll be nullifying the enemy's attack while doing chip damage to them, so you don't actually need to worry about too much defensive capability, provided you have enough curse energy. But the main problem with this is that the counterattack only works when the enemy takes a single target attack, when they do a single target attack. So if the enemy do have any AoE, etc., then you need to find other ways to protect yourself against those. So that's kind of why I feel like it's just not as good as kind of the standard store team, either using Mahito or DPS, where you have a way around both like single target and the AoE attack, because it's going to take you just as long to slowly counter and wear down the enemy as a store strategy, and you are only able to use it in half of the scenarios. So that's kind of why I personally don't recommend the counter team when you already have a store team out there. But it can potentially be, quite cool off meta team that you can try out if you really want to.